What might compel a hospice nurse to abandon every belief she held concerning the mind, memory, and the intricate journey of death? Today, we delve into the compelling narrative of Rebecca Martinez, who dedicated a decade to guiding patients through their final moments. Yet one fragile elderly woman diagnosed with Alzheimer's would challenge everything Rebecca believed to be true. Before we immerse ourselves in this story, please consider subscribing. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers, so please like the video and share your location in the comments. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and prepare for a tale that may profoundly alter your perception of consciousness, mortality, and what lies beyond. There are instances in life where reality seems to fragment, where the seemingly solid ground beneath one's feet dissolves, revealing an abyss of unimaginable truths. I personally experienced such a moment 18 months ago, and the repercussions of that encounter continue to reshape my understanding of consciousness, identity, and the very essence of human existence. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and for a decade I served as a hospice nurse at Serenity Gardens, a quaint residential facility nestled amidst the mountains of northern Colorado. I always found solace in the predictable rhythms of end-of-life care, the gentle routines, the hushed conversations, the serene transitions from life to whatever follows. Death, I firmly believed, was the most natural occurrence, as inevitable and orderly as the changing of the seasons. I was profoundly mistaken about every aspect. The patient who fundamentally altered my grasp of reality was Mrs. Vivian Thorne, an 82-year-old former psychology professor who arrived at our facility on a frigid February evening. Her medical records indicated advanced Alzheimer's disease, with perhaps only weeks left to live. Her daughter, Dr. Amanda Thorne, a neuroscientist, had reluctantly placed her mother in our care after exhausting all other options. What rendered Mrs. Thorne's case distinctive was not her medical condition. We had attended to numerous Alzheimer's patients over the years. Her extraordinary nature lay in what transpired during her fleeting moments of lucidity, brief windows of clarity that seemed to defy all conventional understanding of her disease. During these episodes, Mrs. Thorne would speak with perfect coherence about events and individuals that, according to her daughter, she had never encountered or known. She would meticulously describe conversations with people who had passed away decades before Mrs. Thorne's birth. Most unsettling of all, she would occasionally look directly at me, addressing me by names I had never heard, conversing as if we shared memories that I was certain we had never created together. Initially, I attributed these episodes to the intricate nature of dementia. The brain, I theorized, was simply generating false memories and confabulations as it deteriorated. However, as the days progressed, Mrs. Thorne's hallucinations became increasingly specific and consistent. She would precisely describe the layout of rooms that had undergone renovations before her relocation to Colorado. She would mention names and details that appeared too precise to be random fabrications. I found myself caught between an innate skepticism and a burgeoning sense of disquiet. The turning point occurred during my third week of caring for Mrs. Thorne. I was seated with her during one of her lucid periods when she suddenly seized my hand with surprising strength. "Rebecca," she uttered, her eyes fixing upon mine with an intensity that made me uneasy. "You must comprehend what is happening to me. This isn't dementia. This isn't my brain deteriorating. This is something entirely different." "Mrs. Thorne, you're confused. The disease affects memory." "And I'm not confused," she interjected. "I'm remembering, but I'm not remembering my own life. I'm remembering theirs." "Whose memories?" She released my hand and leaned back against her pillows, her expression growing distant. "The others who died here, their memories, their experiences, they're all still present, Rebecca. They're ensnared in this place, and somehow I'm accessing them." A shiver ran down my spine. "Mrs. Thorne, that's not possible. Memory doesn't function that way." "Doesn't it?" she inquired, fixing me with that piercing stare once more. "Tell me, Rebecca, what do you know about the history of this building?" I realized that despite several years of employment at Serenity Gardens, I knew remarkably little about its past. The facility had been converted from a private residence in the 1990s, but I had never delved into its earlier history. "I see you don't know," Mrs. Thorne continued. "This house was constructed in the 1920s by a man who was deeply invested in spiritualism and the potential for communicating with the deceased. He designed this house as a spiritual laboratory of sorts." "How do you know all this?" "Because I'm remembering it through the eyes of his daughter, Margaret. She passed away in this house in 1947. I can perceive her memories as vividly as my own. More clearly, in fact, because her mind wasn't clouded by illness." Over the ensuing days, I found myself increasingly drawn into Mrs. Thorne's peculiar assertions. During her periods of lucidity, she would recount detailed narratives of life within the house across different eras, but always from the perspective of two specific individuals: Margaret, the spiritualist's daughter, and Thomas, a man who had perished in a fire sometime in the 1960s. What made these accounts so unsettling was their emotional consistency. When Mrs. Thorne spoke as Margaret, her entire demeanor would shift. She would become more refined, speaking with a subtle accent that was not her own, humming classical melodies that she claimed Margaret had cherished. When embodying Thomas, she would exhibit protective instincts and a concern for others with a direct, working-class manner that utterly diverged from her usual reserved personality. Driven by an insatiable curiosity and a growing sense of unease, I began researching the history of our building during my off hours. What I uncovered in the local historical society's archives was fragmentary but disquieting. There were mentions of a Margaret in some old correspondence, although the handwriting was challenging to decipher and the context unclear. I located records of a fire at the address in the 1960s, but the details were sparse, merely a brief newspaper mention of casualties, including someone with the surname Morrison. The evidence was tantalizing, yet incomplete. Nothing I discovered definitively corroborated Mrs. Thorne's claims, but neither did anything explicitly contradict them. The lacunae in the historical record seemed to provide just enough space for her improbable memories to exist. However, it was during one of Mrs. Thorne's episodes that I experienced something that profoundly rattled me. She'd been channeling Margaret's memories when she abruptly looked directly at me and stated, "You remind me of my sister, Catherine. She possessed your same kind eyes, your same gentle way of navigating the world." The words themselves weren't particularly remarkable, but as she uttered them, I felt something I had never before encountered. A sudden, overwhelming feeling of familiarity, as if I were recalling something I had long forgotten. For a fleeting moment, I could almost perceive myself through Margaret's eyes, could almost feel the warmth of a sisterly bond that had never existed in my own life. The sensation lasted only seconds, but it left me profoundly shaken. I began to question not only what I was witnessing, but also what I believed about the nature of memory and identity itself. As Mrs. Thorne's physical condition continued to decline, her access to these unfamiliar memories seemed to intensify. She would spend hours recounting the life stories of Margaret and Thomas, speaking with such intimate knowledge that it was as if she had lived their lives herself. But it was the emotional authenticity of these episodes that proved most convincing. The way she would tear up when describing Margaret's loneliness following her father's death, or the urgency in her voice when channeling Thomas's memories of attempting to rescue others during the fire. The most disturbing aspect of these episodes was their impact on Mrs. Thorne's sense of self. During her lucid moments, she would express confusion regarding her own identity, unsure which memories belonged to her and which belonged to the others. "I recall being a child in this house," she told me one evening, "playing in the garden with my sister. But I also remember being a man, striving to save people from smoke and flames. How can I remember all of these lives, Rebecca? How can I be all of these people?" I utterly lacked an answer for her. Nothing in my medical training had equipped me for such a situation. I consulted with Dr. Amanda Thorne, Mrs. Thorne's daughter, but she was equally perplexed by her mother's condition. The neurological damage from Alzheimer's should render these kinds of detailed, coherent memories impossible, Dr. Thorne explained during one of our conversations. What my mother is experiencing defies everything we understand about neuroscience. It was Dr. Thorne who proposed that we systematically document her mother's claims. Together, we began recording Mrs. Thorne's accounts, though we maintained the privacy and limited scope of our investigation. What emerged was a portrait of two distinct personalities, Margaret and Thomas, whose stories appeared to intertwine throughout the history of the house. Margaret seemed to have been a sensitive, artistic woman who had resided in the house between the 1920s and 1940s. Through Mrs. Thorne's channeling, she spoke of seances conducted in the parlor, of her father's obsession with contacting the deceased, and of her own burgeoning ability to sense the presence of spirits within the house. She had died young, apparently from tuberculosis, but not before experiencing what she termed a profound connection to the consciousness of others who had passed away in the house. Thomas, a grounded individual who served as the house's caretaker when it became a boarding house in the 1960s, held memories, channeled through Mrs. Thorne, that consistently focused on the well-being of its residents, particularly the older and frail. His demise occurred during an electrical fire, an attempt to rescue others, and his awareness seemed to bear the imprint of that ultimate, valiant deed. What truly captivated me about these two personalities was their profound distinction from Mrs. Thorne's own character and their unwavering consistency across numerous encounters. Margaret invariably presented as refined and melancholic, with a deep affection for music and poetry. Thomas, conversely, was perpetually protective and pragmatic, consistently concerned with the welfare of others. These were not mere facets of Mrs. Thorne's personality. They were entirely separate individuals, seemingly utilizing her mind as a temporary vessel. As Mrs. Thorne's physical condition deteriorated, I found myself undergoing internal changes I couldn't entirely grasp. The certainty I once held regarding the nature of death and consciousness began to erode, supplanted by an increasing sense of wonder and ambiguity. I started to listen more intently to all my patients, paying close attention to their final utterances and their assertions of perceiving deceased loved ones. Death, in my evolving perception, was no longer a mere cessation, but something more enigmatic, a transition whose true essence we might never fully comprehend. During one particularly intense episode, Mrs. Thorne simultaneously channeled both Margaret and Thomas, appearing to facilitate a conversation between them. She would articulate in Margaret's cultivated voice, then pause, and respond in Thomas's more direct manner, as if orchestrating a dialogue between two long-separated old acquaintances. "The fire wasn't your fault," she uttered in Margaret's voice. "You saved 3 people that night." Then, switching to Thomas's voice, she continued, "But I couldn't save them all. Mrs. Henderson was too frightened to move." Margaret's voice rejoined, "You did what you could. That's all any of us can do." Witnessing this exchange, I felt as though I were observing something sacred, a convergence of consciousness that transcended the confines of life and death. Regardless of whether it was genuine or merely a manifestation of Mrs. Thorne's declining mind, it possessed an undeniably potent emotional resonance. As Mrs. Thorne's final days neared, her episodes grew more frequent and serene. She would occasionally spend entire afternoons immersed in the past, experiencing the lives of Margaret and Thomas as if they were her own. During these periods, she appeared happier and more tranquil than she had been since her arrival. "I understand now," she confided in one of her final lucid moments. "This isn't a curse or a disease. It's a gift. Margaret and Thomas, they're not truly gone. They're still here, still woven into the fabric of this place. And somehow, I've been chosen to be their voice, to ensure that their stories aren't forgotten." The most extraordinary episode transpired just days before Mrs. Thorne's passing. She had been mostly unresponsive for hours when she abruptly sat upright in bed, her eyes shining and alert. "They're both here," she declared, surveying the room as if perceiving individuals I could not. "Margaret and Thomas. They've come to welcome me, to help me understand what comes next." For the subsequent hour, Mrs. Thorne engaged in what could only be described as a 3-way conversation. She would speak in her own voice, then pause as if apprehending replies, and then respond in either Margaret's or Thomas's voice. It was as if she were functioning as a translator between varying levels of consciousness. "Yes, I understand," she articulated at one point in her own voice. "The memories, the experiences, they're not lost when we die. They become part of something larger, something that connects us all." Mrs. Thorne passed away peacefully that evening, enveloped by her daughter and the staff who had come to deeply care for her. Her death embodied our aspirations for hospice care, dignified, comfortable, and surrounded by affection. However, Mrs. Thorne's passing also marked the cessation of the extraordinary phenomenon we had witnessed. In the ensuing days and weeks, no other patients at Serenity Gardens reported similar experiences. The consciousness transfers, the channeling of Margaret and Thomas, all of it appeared to have concluded with Mrs. Thorne. Dr. Amanda Thorne and I continued to examine the recordings we had made, but we maintained the privacy of our investigation. Dr. Thorne was apprehensive that publicizing her mother's case could lead to undesirable attention or the exploitation of vulnerable patients. She composed a brief account of the experience, yet it was never published, instead shared only with a select few trusted colleagues who specialized in consciousness and near-death experiences. For me, the impact of Mrs. Thorne's case was profound and enduring. Her experiences had shattered my previous understanding of death as a definitive conclusion. If consciousness could somehow persist and be accessed by others, then death was not the absolute barrier I had always envisioned. This realization reshaped my approach to my work as a hospice nurse. I began listening more meticulously to my patients' final words, noting their assertions of seeing deceased relatives or experiencing memories that did not seem to be their own. I started to perceive death not as an end, but as a metamorphosis, a transition from individual awareness to something vaster and more intricately connected. The room Mrs. Thorne had occupied transformed into one of the most serene spaces in our facility. Subsequent patients who resided there reported uncommonly restful sleep and a sense of solace they couldn't quite articulate. Some recounted dreams where they were visited by a benevolent older woman who would sit beside their bed and gently hold their hand. Others mentioned feeling safeguarded by a protective presence, as if someone were ensuring their security during their final days. I frequently worked in that room during my remaining months at Serenity Gardens, and I found it to be a place of unusual tranquility. The atmosphere, which had been so intensely charged during Mrs. Thorne's episodes, had settled into something more peaceful, as though the conscious energies so active during her stay had attained a state of rest and harmony. The facility's administration was aware of Mrs. Thorne's unusual case, but they chose to handle it with discretion. They did not pursue publicity or attention, instead prioritizing the provision of the best possible care for all patients, irrespective of any unusual experiences they might report. The staff became more attentive to patients' accounts of dreams, visions, or peculiar sensations, treating these reports with respect rather than dismissal. While I never encountered another case as dramatic as Mrs. Thorne's, I began to pay closer heed to my patients' reports of unusual experiences. Some of these experiences, upon quiet investigation, proved to contain elements difficult to explain through conventional means. Patients would describe deceased individuals with remarkable accuracy or furnish details about historical events they had never studied. While none of these instances approached the extraordinary nature of Mrs. Thorne's experiences, they suggested that consciousness might be more intricate and resilient than we had previously understood. The legacy of Mrs. Thorne's case extended into my personal life as well. Her experiences had fundamentally altered my understanding of death and dying, transforming my approach not only to my profession, but also to my own mortality. I no longer feared death as an absolute termination, but viewed it as a transition into something potentially different, yet not necessarily final. This shift in perspective influenced my relationships with family and friends, particularly during periods of loss and grief. I found myself capable of offering comfort and hope that transcended conventional religious or philosophical assurances. While I couldn't guarantee that consciousness endured after death, I could share the possibility that Mrs. Thorne's case had unveiled, that death might not be the absolute boundary we had always presumed. As I eventually transitioned to a new position at another hospice facility, I carried with me not only the memory of Mrs. Thorne's extraordinary case, but a fundamentally transformed appreciation of what it meant to care for the dying. I had learned that consciousness might be far more mysterious and resilient than we had ever imagined, that the divisions between individual minds might be more fluid than we realized, and that death might not be an ending, but a transformation into something we were only beginning to fathom. Mrs. Vivian Thorne, the patient who irrevocably changed everything for me, possessed unique abilities that offered a glimpse into possibilities challenging all our preconceptions about consciousness, memory, and the very nature of human existence. Her legacy persisted not in scientific publications or public acclaim, but in the quiet transformation of perspective she initiated in those of us who had borne witness to her remarkable journey. Mrs. Thorne had demonstrated that the enigma of consciousness was far more profound than we had ever conceived, that the line between life and death might be more permeable than we had dared to hope, and that the connections we forged with others might endure in ways we were only beginning to comprehend. I never publicly discussed Mrs. Thorne's case. It remained a private experience, shared solely with those who had witnessed it firsthand and a few trusted colleagues who understood the delicate nature of our observations. Yet the impact of her story continued to influence my work and my understanding of what it meant to care for the dying. Years later, Mrs. Thorne and the extraordinary abilities she displayed during her final weeks still occupy my thoughts. I often ponder if there are others akin to her, individuals gifted with the rare sensitivity to perceive the patterns of consciousness that might linger in certain locales. I muse whether Margaret and Thomas remain in that room, patiently awaiting the next receptive soul capable of apprehending their voices. What I hold with absolute certainty is that Mrs. Thorne irrevocably altered my perspective, transforming my understanding of death from a mere conclusion into a transition, from a barrier into an open door. She illuminated for me that the duties of a hospice nurse extend beyond merely offering solace during the dying process. It encompasses bearing witness to the profound enigma of human consciousness and the deep interconnections that bind us all. On my final evening at Serenity Gardens, I spent a few solitary moments in Mrs. Thorne's former room. The space was quiet and imbued with a sense of peace, yet there was something more, a presence that felt both familiar and reassuring. My thoughts drifted to Margaret and Thomas, to their narratives and their intrinsic link to this place, and for a fleeting instant, I could have sworn I detected the faint strains of classical music drifting through the air and experienced the gentle caress of a protective hand upon my shoulder. I turned, but the room was empty. Or perhaps it was not. Perhaps it never truly had been. Ultimately, Mrs. Thorne's most profound gift was not the answers she furnished, but the profound questions she provoked. These questions concerned the essence of consciousness, the potential for survival beyond death, and the enigmatic ties that unite us all. Her remarkable case had unveiled a vista into mysteries humanity has contemplated for millennia, instilling hope that death might not be the absolute cessation we had always dreaded. The room was silent now, but it was never merely silent again, and in some inexplicable way, that made all the difference. The weeks following Mrs. Thorne's passing ushered in a period of quiet contemplation that would fundamentally reshape my comprehension of hospice care and the very nature of human consciousness. While the extraordinary phenomenon we had observed seemed to have ceased with her, the ramifications of her case continued to resonate through every facet of my professional and personal life. Dr. Amanda Thorne remained deeply engaged in analyzing the limited data we had amassed during her mother's stay. The recordings of Mrs. Thorne's episodes comprised a modest yet comprehensive archive that she meticulously studied privately, disclosing her findings only to a select few colleagues who specialized in consciousness research. What emerged from this analysis was a portrayal of consciousness that challenged numerous preconceptions about the essence of human identity and memory. The evidence we had collected was compelling but incomplete. Dr. Thorne had successfully corroborated some of Mrs. Thorne's assertions through historical records. The fire in the 1960s had indeed occurred, and there were fragmentary references to both Margaret and Thomas in various documents, but many specifics remained unconfirmed, residing in the lacunae between official records and familial recollections. What my mother experienced may never be fully elucidated, Dr. Thorne confided in me during one of our final discussions about the case. However, the consistency of her accounts, the emotional authenticity of her episodes, and the historical details she provided suggest that something truly extraordinary was unfolding. Whether it was genuine consciousness transfer or some unidentified neurological anomaly, it warrants documentation and remembrance. Dr. Thorne enlisted the expertise of Dr. Sarah Kellerman, a neuropsychologist, to conduct a discrete analysis of the recordings. Dr. Kellerman found Mrs. Thorne's case fascinating, yet she exercised caution in drawing any conclusive inferences. What we observed challenges our fundamental understanding of how consciousness and memory operate, Dr. Kellerman elucidated. After several weeks of study, Mrs. Thorne was accessing information she had never acquired, exhibiting personality traits completely alien to her own, and speaking with knowledge that predated her birth. The neurological damage from her Alzheimer's should have rendered these kinds of coherent, detailed memories impossible. But without the ability to replicate these conditions or investigate similar cases, we can only document what we observed, not provide an explanation. The most persuasive aspect of Dr. Kellerman's analysis was her meticulous documentation of the distinct personality patterns that materialized during Mrs. Thorne's episodes. When embodying Margaret, Mrs. Thorne consistently displayed specific mannerisms, speech patterns, and emotional responses that were utterly dissimilar to her baseline personality. When accessing Thomas's memories, she exhibited different but equally consistent behavioral traits. These were not mere variations of Mrs. Thorne's personality, Dr. Kellerman concluded. They were distinct psychological profiles that maintained stability across multiple episodes. This consistency implies that she was accessing genuine personality patterns that had somehow been preserved beyond death. During one particularly intense episode that we had recorded, Mrs. Thorne channeled a conversation between Margaret and Thomas that divulged details about their relationship we had never previously encountered. Speaking as Margaret, she recounted how Thomas had shown her kindness during her final illness, bringing her flowers from the garden and sitting with her during her worst days. When channeling Thomas, she spoke of Margaret's courage in confronting death and how her peaceful transition had offered him hope during his own final moments years later. They knew each other, Dr. Thorne observed as we reviewed the recording, not merely as individuals who had cohabited the same house, but as friends who had forged a genuine connection across time. My mother was somehow accessing not just their individual memories, but the emotional bonds that united them. This revelation introduced another layer of complexity to Mrs. Thorne's case. If she was indeed accessing the consciousness of the deceased, she was not merely channeling isolated individuals. She was tapping into a network of relationships and connections that had persisted beyond death. As the months unfolded, I found myself repeatedly returning to the recordings of Mrs. Thorne's episodes. Each time I listened, I unearthed new details that I had missed during the actual events. The subtle shifts in her voice when channeling different personalities, the specific mannerisms she would adopt, the emotional authenticity of her accounts. All of it unequivocally pointed to something far more intricate than simple confabulation or false memory. Yet it was the profound emotional impact of her story that affected me most deeply. Mrs. Thorne's experiences had compelled me to confront fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and death that I had never seriously considered before. If consciousness could somehow endure death and be accessed by others, what would that signify for how we comprehend human existence? What did it imply for how we cared for the dying? These questions began to permeate every aspect of my work. I started paying closer attention to my patients' final words, listening for allusions to individuals or occurrences that might not be part of their own memories. I became more perceptive to changes in personality or behavior that might suggest something beyond ordinary confusion or the effects of medication. While I never encountered another case as dramatic as Mrs. Thorne's, I began to discern subtle patterns that I had previously overlooked. Patients would sometimes speak with knowledge they shouldn't have possessed, or exhibit personality traits entirely unlike their usual demeanor. These episodes were brief and easily dismissed as confusion, but they occurred with sufficient frequency to make me wonder if consciousness transfer might be more prevalent than we realized. One elderly gentleman, succumbing to cancer, spent his final days conversing fluently in Italian, despite having no known connection to Italy or the Italian language. His family was bewildered, but when I investigated the history of his room, I discovered that an Italian immigrant had died there in the 1980s. The connection might have been coincidental, but it reminded me of Mrs. Thorne's case and prompted me to consider if some places might be more conducive to consciousness phenomena than others. A woman afflicted with dementia began playing piano pieces she had never learned, her fingers gliding across an imaginary keyboard with surprising skill and precision. When I inquired about the music, she stated she was playing Margaret's favorite songs. There was no conceivable way she could have known about Margaret Whitfield, but the coincidence was unsettling. These incidents were subtle and could readily be explained by conventional means, but they occurred frequently enough to suggest that consciousness might be more fluid and transferable than we had ever imagined. Perhaps Mrs. Thorne's extraordinary sensitivity had enabled us to observe and document what is typically a subtle and overlooked aspect of the dying process. The room where Mrs. Thorne had resided became a sanctuary within our facility. Subsequent patients who occupied the space often reported unusually peaceful experiences, vivid dreams, and a sense of comfort they couldn't quite articulate. Some spoke of feeling watched over by benevolent presences, of sensing they were not alone during their final days. I made a point of spending time in that room whenever possible, and I found it to be a place of unique tranquility and introspection. The atmosphere that had been so charged and intense during Mrs. Thorne's episodes had settled into something more peaceful, yet there was still an undercurrent of something extraordinary, a pervasive sense that the boundaries between life and death were somehow thinner within that space. The facility's administration was aware of Mrs. Thorne's unusual case, but they chose to manage it with discretion. Rather than seeking advertising or notoriety, their primary focus remained on ensuring optimal patient care, irrespective of any unusual experiences reported. Staff members became increasingly receptive to patients' accounts of dreams, visions, or atypical sensations, affording these narratives respect instead of categorical dismissal. This alteration in methodology profoundly shifted the institutional culture. Patients appeared more at ease discussing their experiences, secure in the knowledge that they would be heard rather than disregarded. Families reported greater support during the challenging process of bidding farewell to loved ones. The acceptance that death might encompass mysteries beyond our current comprehension brought solace instead of apprehension. Dr. Amanda Thorne eventually penned a private account of her mother's situation, but she deliberately chose against publication. Instead, she circulated it exclusively among a select group of trusted associates engaged in the study of consciousness and near-death experiences. She believed her mother's narrative was too precious and sensitive for public scrutiny or skepticism. "My mother's experience was extraordinary, yet profoundly personal," Dr. Thorne elucidated. "I wish to honor her memory by preserving her story, but also to safeguard it from those who might exploit or sensationalize it. Certain truths are too vital to be reduced to mere entertainment." The investigations conducted during Mrs. Thorne's stay contributed to a modest yet expanding body of literature on consciousness studies and anomalous experiences within terminal care. While the mechanics behind her abilities remained enigmatic, the detailed documentation of her case furnished invaluable data for researchers delving into the essence of human consciousness. Dr. Kellerman integrated some of these findings into her continuous research on consciousness and memory, though she scrupulously refrained from making any definitive assertions regarding the nature of Mrs. Thorne's experiences. "We witnessed something extraordinary," she would remark to colleagues, "but we must remain humble about what we can and cannot elucidate." For the families of patients at Serenity Gardens, Mrs. Thorne's tale offered both solace and wonder. Many found comfort in the prospect of consciousness persisting after death, believing their loved ones might continue to exist in some form beyond physical demise. The story diffused discreetly, passed among families as a beacon of hope during trying periods. The reverberations of Mrs. Thorne's case extended into my own life. Her experiences fundamentally reshaped my perception of death and dying, altering my approach not only to my profession, but also to my own mortality. I no longer viewed death as an absolute conclusion, but as a transition into something potentially different, yet not necessarily final. This shift in perspective influenced my relationships with family and friends, particularly during moments of loss and grief. I found myself capable of offering comfort and hope that transcended conventional religious or philosophical assurances. While I couldn't guarantee that consciousness endured after death, I could convey the possibility, as Mrs. Thorne's case suggested, that death might not be the absolute boundary we had always presumed it to be. My transformation in understanding was gradual but profound. Prior to Mrs. Thorne, I approached death with professional competence but emotional detachment. I offered comfort and care, yet I primarily regarded death as a medical event, the cessation of biological function. After witnessing her extraordinary abilities, I began to perceive death as something far more enigmatic and potentially meaningful. I started to discern details I had previously overlooked, the way some patients seemed to achieve clarity and serenity in their final moments, as if perceiving or comprehending something beyond the physical realm. The striking frequency with which dying patients spoke of deceased relatives or friends, often with remarkable specificity and emotion. The palpable sense of presence many families reported feeling in the rooms of their departed loved ones. These observations didn't conclusively prove anything, but they intimated that the demarcation between life and death might be more intricate and porous than we had ever conceived. Mrs. Thorne's case had opened my eyes to possibilities I had never seriously entertained, and once opened, they could never again be shut. As I eventually transitioned to a new role at another hospice facility, I carried with me not only the memory of Mrs. Thorne's remarkable case, but also a fundamentally altered comprehension of what it meant to care for the dying. I had learned that consciousness might be far more mysterious and resilient than we had ever imagined, that the boundaries between individual minds might be more fluid than we realized, and that death might not be an ending, but a metamorphosis into something we were just beginning to grasp. The patient who irrevocably changed me was Mrs. Vivian Thorne, a woman whose singular abilities offered a glimpse into possibilities that challenged everything we thought we knew about consciousness, memory, and the very nature of human existence. Her legacy persisted, not in scientific treatises or public acclaim, but in the quiet, profound transformation of perspective she engendered in those of us who had witnessed her extraordinary journey. Mrs. Thorne demonstrated that the enigma of consciousness was far deeper than we had ever appreciated, that the boundary between life and death might be more permeable than we had dared to hope, and that the connections we forge with others might endure in ways we were only starting to fathom. Her story served as a poignant reminder that there remained so much we did not understand about the human experience, and that sometimes the most profound truths emerged from the most unexpected sources. I never publicly discussed Mrs. Thorne's case. It remained a private encounter shared solely with those who experienced it firsthand and a few trusted colleagues who understood the delicate nature of our observations. Yet the impact of her story continued to influence my work and my understanding of what it meant to care for the dying. Years later, I still reflect on Mrs. Thorne and the extraordinary abilities she exhibited during her final weeks. I ponder whether there are others like her, individuals possessing the rare sensitivity to access consciousness patterns that might linger in certain locales. I wonder if Margaret and Thomas remain in that room, awaiting the next sensitive soul capable of hearing their voices. What I know with certainty is that Mrs. Thorne irrevocably changed everything for me. She transformed my understanding of death from an ending into a transition, from a boundary into a doorway. She revealed that the work of a hospice nurse encompasses more than merely providing comfort during the dying process. It involves bearing witness to the full mystery of human consciousness and the profound connections that bind us all across the thresholds of life and death. Her story endures with me as a powerful reminder that there is still so much we do not comprehend about the nature of human existence, and that sometimes the most extraordinary truths are unveiled not through scientific study or academic research, but through the quiet, intimate moments we share with those embarking on the ultimate transition from life to whatever lies beyond.